Stop me if you think you've heard this one before. Malekith, the leader of the Dark Elves, steals an ancient artifact with the power to change the world, and tries to use it to create a new habitat for his people. The only thing is, this new realm is utterly inhospitable for the rest of us. He's narrowly stopped though, by Thor and a plucky band of heroes who combine magic and science to thwart his plans. Sounds familiar, right? Well, I'm actually not talking about Marvel Studios' 2013 film Thor: The Dark World. I'm talking about an episode of a much beloved Avengers TV show, which aired a couple of years beforehand. And here's the kicker, this alternate version of Thor: The Dark World, it's better in a lot of ways. How's that for a snappy intro? Anyhow, today I want to take a look at Season 1, Episode 20 of the show Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, and argue that it tells this somewhat familiar story in a more dramatic and socially responsible way than the version we got on the big screen. To be clear, this isn't exactly the same story. The supporting cast is almost entirely different, and the settings, subplots, and MacGuffins in question also diverge greatly. But the core plot beats I described a minute ago mean the two are similar enough in my eyes to warrant comparison. So, in case you haven't seen it, this episode, The Casket of Ancient Winters, opens with a mysterious traveller, soon revealed to be Malekith the Accursed, reaching an icy Norwegian cavern within which he finds, well, the Casket of Ancient Winters. In a bid to terraform the Earth into a climate more fitting for his people, the Dark Elves, he unleashes this power and starts a worldwide deep freeze. Over in New York, the Avengers had just finished beating up Radioactive Man. Thor's getting all self-righteous over the harmful capacity of mortal science.
Yet again, your mortal science creates monsters. Truly, man's technology causes nothing but harm.
Wow, it's kind of harsh.
And this continues until snow starts falling, ice monsters start emerging, and things generally go nuts as a result of Malekith's actions in Norway. Naturally, Tony starts bickering right back, complaining about magic, until, with the help of T'Challa, the squad figures out the location of this little Ice Age's epicenter. And so the team goes on a Norwegian holiday to beat up Malekith and reverse the effects of the casket, but they're having difficulty doing this until Thor and Iron Man get over their spat, team up, and decide to supercharge Tony's mechanical suit with Thor's magical lightning, with a glorious victory following shortly thereafter. So that's what we're dealing with. But what makes this version better? Well, it mostly comes down to this version of Malekith. Frankly, he's almost better developed in this 20-minute episode than he is in the 2-hour film. But in terms of concrete things in the scripts of these stories, the most obvious starting point is that he's actually shown to be a formidable foe. The Dark World focuses a lot more on the other Dark Elves, and as a result, a good deal of the elves' on-screen presence comes from Algrim, or Curse, who functions as Malekith's muscle for much of the piece. And this isn't a bad choice per se, but the result of this is a Malekith who spends the first half of the film in the shadows, plotting, sending pawns to do his work. But the film's climax comes down to a prolonged physical showdown between Malekith and Thor, one which Thor eventually wins. I feel one result of this structure is that we don't get a great sense of the stakes of the individual threat Malekith poses in this final section because of his initial puppet master role. True, we see him winning small victories before the final showdown, like the battle on Svartalfheim, but in the Asgard attack sequence, he's pretty much just in and out. And in both of these earlier moments, it's Curse who's beating our heroes, not Malekith. By comparison, the shorter story in the cartoon doesn't have time to beat around the bush with secondary antagonists, faceless ice goons notwithstanding. As a result of this, more focus is on Malekith, but it's not just the increased focus, comparatively speaking, which makes this Malekith a better villain. It's the way we're shown from the start of the episode that he is a formidable threat in his own right. After he gets the casket, for instance, he outfoxes and defeats the Enchantress and Scourge immediately. And we, the audience, have seen previously that it takes a lot to beat these two villains. And when our heroes eventually come face to face with this Malekith, the villain also fares a lot better than his MCU counterpart. While 9th Doctor Malekith is beat by one single superhero, Thor, essentially just getting shanked, Earth's Mightiest Heroes Malekith is able to pretty much single-handedly dominate the entire Avengers team. He's only beaten when, as as noted earlier, Thor and Iron Man combine their magic and technology, resolving that episode's earlier thematic discord. The point is, a stronger, more dominant Malekith is a more worrying prospect for the viewer, and when he's defeated through the almost Chekhov's gun-like fulfillment of the episode's magic versus science thread, the victory is all the sweeter. This Malekith was never a recurring villain, but he was a formidable one, and his antagonism made for a compelling episode. And, you'd imagine, the inhabitants of this world will long remember the day when the world turned almost inhospitable. In contrast, Malekith never felt individually threatening in the MCU, due in large part to the way we saw him get soloed relatively easily, and the stakes are similarly a lot lower. While there was a lot of big talk in the Dark World about the universe being returned to its primordial darkness and so on, that's just talk. You know what they say about seeing and believing, and all we saw was a couple of pointy ships over London, and a few minutes of weird gravity in Greenwich. And hey, Greenwich is a lovely place, but a portal here and there versus a worldwide deep freeze? Not exactly on the same level. Another reason this Malekith works better, and this story works better, is down to language. See, Earth's Mightiest Heroes Malekith speaks plain old English, while the Dark Elves of the Dark World converse primarily in Shivaisith, a conlang created specifically for the film. They can speak in Asgardian or English as well, and this language is a cool bit of world building, even though space in the MCU seems wildly inconsistent with regard to language and translation. But another result is less positive. It also means there's this big filter between our heroes and our villains in a lot of cases. Malekith can speak English and tends to when speaking to Thor, but there's a few moments like this in the film.
I bring you a gift. I ask only one thing in return. A good seat from which to watch Asgard burn.
The problem with this language disconnect, then, is that it places two barriers between the villains and those hearing them, both diegetically and on a metatextual level. Let me explain. In scenes like the above, the language barrier between Thor, Loki, and Jane on the one hand, and the elves on the other, means that it's harder for a genuinely antagonistic dynamic to develop, harder for our heroes to become emotionally invested in the proceedings, than if there was clear and direct communication. And a similar disconnect is present between the elves and the viewer. Across the film, we see scenes of elves communicating, reminiscing, plotting, but it's all in this made-up language, which makes it harder for us to connect to the lines, and harder for the actors to deliver them well. Maybe this wouldn't be such a big issue if Chris Eccleston wasn't buried beneath an entire salon's worth of makeup and prosthetics, but he is, so his performance, and the emotion of it, has to struggle through two pretty impermeable barriers, one impeding the actor's physical performance, and the other, the fake language, impeding his vocal performance. I think this is one of the main reasons Malekith is regarded as such a forgettable presence in the MCU, in fact, since Eccleston is clearly no slouch when it comes to creating memorable characters. The thing is though, none of this applies when it comes to Malekith's depiction in the cartoon. He talks directly to the Avengers, and intelligibly to his fellow Asgardian villains. As a result, while this voiceover isn't like Oscar-worthy, we're able to connect to it, and we're able to see an instant hateful rivalry spring up as he exchanges lines with the Avengers.
Why have you unleashed this winter upon the Earth?
I had heard that Thor turned his back on his father, choosing this mortal realm over Asgard.
Look, Malekith appears just this once in the show's whole run. This isn't some S-tier iconic depiction, but this Malekith does give us a pretty vicious and compelling one-off villain for an episode which remains a fun watch even 10 years later. And really, can we say the same about his MCU counterpart? But there is another big failing of the Dark World which this EMH story avoids, tied to this issue of language. And this time it's thematic. You see, it's been argued that the language of the Dark Elves in the Dark World is a crucial component of a really ugly part of that film, a racial othering, which casts Malekith and his people as a caricatured version of some imagined terrorist threat. I'll quickly break down this idea because I don't want to spend ages on it, but essentially, the villains of the Dark World are a step backwards after the more nuanced exploration of the Frost Giants in the first film. See, the Frost Giants are set up as the outsiders, the barbarians at the gates, poised to attack Asgard, but after the early sequence in which Thor and co launch an unprovoked attack at their king, it's revealed that Thor and Loki were the threat here. The earlier belligerent rhetoric and xenophobia is flipped on its head, and while Laufey and the Frost Giants aren't exactly heroes in the film, this seemingly monstrous outgroup end up in a similar state to the Asgardians, realistic characters trying to protect their own, manipulated by Loki. Thus, a message offered by the film is that we should re-examine dominant narratives which push xenophobic or militaristic ideals, that races or groups we're being groomed to hate and fear might not be monsters at all. And, to a degree, the Dark World flips this idealism on its head. Think about it. This time, we don't have a group like the Frost Giants with somewhat understandable sympathetic motives who only attack when they feel backed into a corner. We have an alien group who inhabit some shadowy land and sneak past detection systems to attack the homeland, flying ships into the buildings which represent the ostensibly just and noble qualities of the homeland, aiming to destroy ideals and illusions of safety as much as infrastructure. And these aliens, these invisible invaders, are driven by quasi-religious ideals, a manichaeistic pursuit of some universal force of darkness. Look, I don't want to have another video this month get demonetized, so I'll keep this vague, but if you watched the news or read the paper in any Western country during the 2000s or 2010s, I think you'll recognize this narrative. I mean, if you need any more convincing that terrorism was on the MCU's mind, just look at another film which dropped in 2013, Iron Man 3. The Dark Elves then become little more than terrorist stand-ins, and the cherry on top is that they speak an entirely unintelligible language, the clearest sign of this process of othering. Thor the Dark World then offers a message which seems to fly in the face of Thor 1's. You're right to fear these shadowy threats, it says. They will stop at nothing to remake the world in their image, and there's no place for you in that new dark reality. But hey, guess how much of this ugly bellicose xenophobia there is in the EMH Malekith story? That's right, none. And while it's an oversimplification to boil all this down to how Malekith himself is represented in each story, how he talks, I do think that the fact Earth's Mightiest Heroes kept his speech standard, didn't introduce this barrier between Malekith and his foes, goes a long way in avoiding some of the horribly dated thematic swings the Dark World would later take. At the end of the day, Thor 2 is fine. I don't hate it, some of the visuals are really cool, and the main cast are fun to watch, but if I want to see the story of how Malekith was defeated, how the Dark Elves' return was stopped, there's a better version I can watch on the same platform in like a sixth of the time. And that last point about how the Dark World others the Dark Elves, I'm sure it's from a YouTube video, or a review, or a Reddit post, but I've spent like an hour looking all over the internet and I can't figure out where I got it from. So if anyone watching this has heard the idea before, please let me know where I nicked it from so I can pin a comment giving proper credit. But before I wrap this up, there's two more little things I want to note. The first being that there's a chance the similarities in these stories aren't coincidence. After all, guess who's listed as one of the writers for Thor the Dark World? That's right, it's Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes story editor, Christopher Yost. But I don't want to overstress this connection, as Yost was brought onto the Dark World fairly late in the day to do rewrites along with a couple of other writers. The script for this film was a hodgepodge of many different drafts by many different people, so I think it's reasonable to assume that much of the story was already set in stone by the time Yost entered the fold. There's also plenty more elements from the Dark World, and indeed the larger MCU Thor franchise, which I've not got into here though. For example, you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned the character many view as the highlight of the Thor sequel. That is Loki. Truth be told, I have a lot to say about Loki in this show, including how he may or may not be reflected by his MCU counterpart. But to avoid things getting too messy, I'm keeping all of that Loki talk for its own video. And similarly, I think I'll be talking about Asgard and the Nine Realms themselves, but that about does it for this video, so just let me plug my Twitter and TikTok, give me a follow if you're new here, and I'll head out. But big thanks, as always, to my patrons on screen now, especially Ian Fifield.